Call Snowden. It's time to use the ballot. March 8th, 2016. Give us the ballot, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. exhorted at a 1957 March on Washington that most Americans are unaware of. They're more familiar with King's famous I Have a Dream speech delivered in 1963. In some ways, the 1957 speech is a better barometer to determine the progress that we have made in race relations and the social justice movement in our nation. If you lived in Anne Arundel County in 1957, when Dr. King called on America to give us the ballot, you would be living in a jurisdiction that had no African Americans serving in any county-wide elected offices. If you were black, you would be paying taxes and yet would not have an opportunity to elect your representatives. In fact, in 1957, if you were black, the only high school you could attend was Wiley H. Bates in Annapolis, regardless of what part of the county you lived in. Too often, people do not stop to think about what the legacy of racism has meant, and more specifically, what being denied the ballot has produced. Here are some facts that cannot be ignored. Only 3 blacks have ever served on the Anne Arundel County Council: the late Sarah Carter, Darrell Jones, and current councilman Pete Smith. Only 1 African American, the late state senator Ernest T. Allen Sr., ever served in the General Assembly from Anne Arundel County. He was first elected as a delegate and later appointed to the Senate. The General Assembly has the dubious distinction in 1909 of passing the grandfather clause that disenfranchised thousands of African American voters and was reversed only after a 1915 U.S. Supreme Court ruling declared it unconstitutional. It was a law that said, in effect, that if your grandfather could not vote, neither could you. Just as the U.S. Supreme Court infamous Dred Scott decision, also written by a Marylander, Chief Judge Roger B. Taney, justified white supremacy and declared blacks had no rights that whites were bound to respect. The General Assembly stripped blacks of the right to vote. In the 366-year history of the judiciary, only 2 African Americans have served on the circuit court in the county: Clayton Green Jr. and the former Judge Rodney C. Warren, that later was appointed by former Governor Perez Glendenning and was later defeated when he ran for election. No black woman has ever served on the circuit court in the county's history. The late Murray Selman Jackson was the only African American to be elected to serve on the county's orphans court. These are the facts. Whenever these facts are stated, some bigoted whites always say that perhaps the black candidates were not qualified. They conveniently want to overlook a racist system based on the premise of white supremacy. They do not want to be reminded that Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, then a segregationist, ran for president and won Anne Arundel County each time he ran, including in 1972. Nor do some whites, including at least 1 circuit court judge, like the fact that there are black legislators and others seeking to remove the statue of Chief Justice Taney from the State House grounds. In 1957, when Dr. King called on the nation to give us the ballot, little did he know, more than 50 years later, not a single African American living in Anne Arundel County would be serving on the county circuit court, school board, or even General Assembly delegation. These are the facts, and we are determined to change them. The caucus of African American leaders hosted a candidates forum for the U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, and circuit court judgeship. Dr. King reminded us that in a democracy, the greatest march an American can participate in is the march to the ballot box. We now have the ballot. Tonight, the march begins. A luta continua, which means in Portuguese that the struggle continues.